Chapter 10, Part 2. So I hope you enjoyed Part 1. I know I did. So our next part, we're going to be looking at Carolingian, Ottonian, and Spanish art and architecture. So now that you have a good background in who all those barbarians were, we're going to look at this, the next phase. Frankish barbarians settled in northern Gaul, shown in the map there, and established a dynasty beginning with Charles the Great, also called Charlemagne, and Carolus Magnus in 768. So I include these other names because Carolus Magnus, which just means Charles the Great in Latin, is where we get Carolingian, that word Carolingian. So Carolus, Carolingian. So Charlemagne imposed Christianity throughout his empire, that's a nice way of saying it, and declared himself the rightful successor to Constantine. So much of the conversion of Europe was not a matter of choice for people. They were rather compelled by their rulers to accept this new religion. So there's some resistance, there's some holders on of pagan religions always, and pagan practices. So let's look. During the Carolingian Empire, the Basilican plan reemerged in architecture and lasted beyond the Middle Ages. So you just have to take my word for it that there's no surviving Carolingian basilica, but there's a drawing of one. So this is a monastery connected to a church. So there's the basilica. And you can see it's kind of hard to read, but there's a raised nave with clerestory windows and a side aisle here. This one has 2 transepts and a tower over each crossing. Here's the apse down here, and it was connected to a courtyard and 2 other smaller churches as part of this community. So Frankish power grew through defeat of Moors in France and negotiations with Pepin the Short, that's Charlemagne's dad, and who had interceded with Lombards on the Pope's behalf. Tensions remained. Charlemagne became emperor in 771, and when he ascended the throne, he attempted to create a renovatio, so the renovatio of Charlemagne. Renovatio means renewal, and he was living in Gaul, so all around him was evidence of the Romans when the Romans had been there, and so he saw Roman ruins and Roman sculpture, and so he thought he idealized the Roman Empire and thought that they must have been some really, really great Christian empire because he knew about Constantine. So he wanted to bring it back. So that's what the Renovatio is all about. So Charlemagne goes on a building campaign and a lot more, but we're first going to look at his building campaign. He saw himself as a new King David, and we know this because there's a lot of writing from his reign. He saw himself as King David, God's chosen and anointed ruler of Europe. He fought almost nonstop during his adult life, just on various frontiers, fighting Saxons in one end, fighting down in Spain, fighting the Moors in the other. Charlemagne went to Italy in 773, and he besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia, and then he spent Easter 774 in Rome. He visited Ravenna maybe 3 times. He gathered an educated court around him. The court is just all the people who are part of the government and his culture. So he gathered an educated court around him, including this very learned monk from England, from the north of England. Because all the things I was showing you from the British Isles, England and Ireland were sort of a hotbed of learning. They became Christian before the continent of Europe did, and they were writing and making many books when most of Europe was still pretty pagan. So he brought down this monk from York in 781, and among his pushes for his renovatio were universal literacy among the priests. He didn't really attempt to have the people literate, able to read, but he wanted all of his priests in his whole empire to be able to read, and he wanted them to have a gospel book so that they could read the actual real stories about Jesus to their people and not just rely on their memory. So it's a good plan. Because of that, he had to have a lot of scriptoria or bookmaking production. We'll see that presently. So I've told you a lot of little factoids about Charlemagne. Let's look and see what he did. He built his capital in what is now Aachen, Germany. It has at various times in history been part of France. So among the structures at his capital, he built this church, this chapel for his private use. And I already told you he had visited Ravenna several times, so he's modeling this church on what he saw in Ravenna. And a lot of his buildings also reflect what he saw in Italy on his trips there. This is a much later illustration of Charlemagne, not a portrait at all, an imagined portrait. So this is the building, his chapel for his palace chapel. I have grayed out later editions because I've tried to do that with my revised PowerPoint so that I don't have to say, ignore that. I just help you ignore it. So this part right here, underneath here is the palace chapel. There's still a lot that I haven't blanked out, but we'll look at this. So this is the interior of the palace chapel on the left. On the right is an interior of San Vitale in Ravenna, a church that he visited on his trip to Italy, because it was there. Of course it was there. So both churches are octagonal. Both of them have a very high center section and ambulatories around the perimeter of this section. They rely on arches. In the case of the palace chapel, there's two levels of arches. There's a ground level and then a higher one up here. And in San Vitale, it's one large arch. This one is also covered with mosaics. I have visited Aachen. I've visited San Vitale as well. And the San Vitale mosaics are contemporary with its construction, but the ones at Aachen are not. They were replaced much later, so we're not even going to look at them. Straight across here in this view of the interior, you can see that little white thing, which is actually a stone chair. That is Charlemagne's throne. So this palace was connected at this upper level by a covered walkway to his palace. And so he could walk from his palace to the church and sit on his throne for Mass. So no matter what the weather was, he could do that. And this shows another cutaway view of Charlemagne's palace chapel, which is not a basilica. It's a central plan, but it's open in the center. And these are the ambulatories and the archways and the aisles, clear story windows, and the dome, the ribbed dome up above. And here's a view of the front of this palace chapel, which is very high and very vertical. There's a lot to be said about this. It's not just a simple little one-story entryway, functional, but it says more. It has a massive statement of power, like the strength of God or the strength of Christianity. It looks kind of fortress-like in its massiveness. And just look at the scale of the entry itself. Like down here are these little people. That little red thing is a person in a red coat. So they're not even as tall as that door. It seems like a lot of people in Europe have liked large doors. I've shown you several. And here's an aerial view. So I described his passageway to his chapel. This is a reconstruction of what the original chapel would have looked like. So it's still quite different from what we see today. That large ribbed dome was not present originally. And this was Charlemagne's palace. This is where he lived. He woke up in the morning, he ate his breakfast, and he walked down here. I'm sorry, he would have gone to Mass before he had breakfast. He woke up, walked down here, all under cover, under a roof, and entered the structure, sat on his little throne seat, and heard Mass. This is an aerial view of the chapel today. So it has some additions. This Gothic room over here, this nave, sort of replaces this little courtyard over here. And this is the city hall, the current city hall of Aachen, which is still connected, by the way. You can still get there, but it's no longer Charlemagne's palace. That's been replaced. So pretty cool. So Charlemagne's big ideas, I've already told you, but I'm just going to emphasize these so you can get a sense of why he was called the Great. So Charlemagne's big ideas, in addition to being Christian, he wanted every priest in his empire to be literate, because they were not, and to have a copy of a gospel book so they would all be teaching from the same text. He also wanted every monastery, and there were lots of them by now, to follow the same rules. Because of the great need of books and literacy, there was a major push to educate and produce books. Several scriptoria, which are manuscript workshops, were founded. Many manuscripts survive to this day. Charlemagne employed Benedictine monks to educate the empire. The monks followed the rule for monasteries and contemplated how to combine work and prayer within a community. Abbot Heito of Reichenau developed a conceptual plan for the perfect monastery known as the St. Gall plan. So I've mentioned monks several times. The monks have been making manuscripts. So we're going to just take a moment to understand this, because it is something that will, in fact, it still survives. There's still monasteries. So Charlemagne employed the Benedictine monks to educate his people. And let's see, that's pretty much the same stuff I just already told you. And how they wanted to combine prayer and work, ora et labora, which is Latin for prayer and work, within a community. It also specified the daily schedule, including several times monks would pray in the chapel, and when and what they would eat. Most monasteries aimed to be self-sufficient, growing and producing everything they needed. And here's an illustration from another a newer manuscript, of a monk. And you can see he's wearing his long robe. This was also required. They would shave a part of their head. This is called the tonsure, to indicate their holiness or their life set apart. They would live apart from society. And this monk here is harvesting some grain. So Abbot Heito of Reichenau developed a conceptual plan for the perfect monastery known as the St. Gall plan. Although the plan is not believed to have been built, there are many similarities to known monasteries. And I'm going to discuss this very briefly, and then later when we look at another church in England, I'll show you how it parallels this. And I hope you can remember this. So the church and the cloister are at the heart of the community. So this is the plan that was tucked into another manuscript, and you can see its fold lines here. So it was folded up and tucked away in another book. So it was never built. It was not part of the plan. It was just sort of thought to be a daydream of a monk. And then it's been transcribed or rewritten, redrawn in a more understandable form over here on the right. So let's look at this. This is the church, which is the heart of the community. And all around this are the various buildings that would be part of the monastery. Right next to the church is this little courtyard called a cloister, and it's enclosed on all four sides. One side is the church, and one side is let's see, I've got to look close. I think this is the dormitory here. And this is the refectory, which means the dining room. And over here is the cellar, which is the storage place for food. And close, or in between the cellar and the dining room, is the kitchen, which is separated from these buildings so that if there were a fire, that there would be no danger of loss of life, them burning. The dormitory here where the monks slept was connected to the church by this little opening. I hope you can see that. And that's because the monks would have to wake up in the middle of the night. I think they came in at midnight and prayed, and they came in at 4 a.m. and prayed. So when I said there were several times during the day that they would be called to prayer and also to Mass, that's what they would do. So a lot of these outer buildings were dedicated to different livestock and gardening and orchards. There's a cemetery. There's a hostel here where travelers or pilgrims could be lodged. There's a kitchen for them here and a guest house for esteemed guests, a school where they would educate boys, not girls. The abbot, that's the head of the whole thing, would live here. A special building for bloodletting, which was the major treatment for the ill. There's a cemetery and orchard, so it looks like a double purpose. You can bury people and grow fruit trees. Vegetable garden, poultry over here. So you can see it is like a self-sustained community. Everything they would need to grow their own food, to provide for themselves, was here. But they also provided hospitality, as I said, for people who were traveling or pilgrims. So, the monastery. Some of them were quite wealthy, and it continues throughout history. So, I think we will mention it a few times more. But I wanted you to get a sense of what a monastery was. And so, the monks lived in this cut-off life, that their interpretation of what God willed for them was to not suffer temptations, to not be out in the world, but to be separated from the world. So now here are two portraits of Matthew, the first gospel writer, portraits included in two Carolingian manuscripts. So I told you that there was this huge push to create more books, and there are many that survive. Many are lost, but many survive. And so we have a lot to look at, a lot of Carolingians. I'm not going to show you a lot, but you're going to see a couple. So here's two Matthews from two different scriptoria that created gospel books. And I want you to notice the similarity of these two. So you see a man, both men are sitting down, and both are engaged in the act of writing. And they're both wearing white garments. The one on the left in particular looks very Roman. So this is part of the renovatio of Charlemagne, where he wanted to renew the Roman Empire. The man has the short Roman haircut, not unlike Caesar Augustus. He has no beard. And he's also got a very large golden halo behind his head. That's because he's considered a saint. He was one of the disciples of Jesus. This Matthew does not have a halo, and his drawing style is completely different. This one is very classicizing, very much like a Roman painting would look. And this guy is very agitated, very stylized. The background, it looks like a lot of scribbly, scratchy lines, and even his robe is done with a very agitated line. The text describes it as very energetic, I think. So there you go, very energetic. And this is an example of an extremely luxurious, rich cover that would have been placed on a gospel book that would maybe be owned by a very wealthy monastery. So some of the monasteries had a lot of money, and that's because people would give money, would leave money to monasteries. Rich people would finance them because they thought that it gained them some benefit in their final judgment, whether they would go to heaven or hell. And so they wanted to do good. They wanted to get into heaven. So they would give a lot of money to monasteries. And they would put their children there. They might retire to a monastery. So it just was quite a system of life, of living in medieval Europe. So this book cover represents the very height of it. This is also the sort of thing that the Vikings would have been hungry to steal. And I showed you the map of their exploits around Europe. They often raided monasteries and would go in and take chalices from the church and book covers, whatever they could find that was of gold or had jewels on it. They had absolutely no use for the book inside, and there were even cases where archaeologists found the book pages torn out and just thrown down on the ground or thrown in a gutter or a hole, and the book cover taken away. So costly manuscripts were protected with heavy wooden book covers. For that reason, they were targets of looters like the Vikings. An example cover of the Lindau Gospels combines jewels and pearls with sculpture and gold. And we're going to look at this kind of close because it's our first real crucifixion. I showed you that Jesus tied up in vines from Denmark on the Yelling Stone, but that is a later monument. That was from around the year 1000. This is earlier. So you can tell that there's a cross in the center. There's a body on the cross. And there's a lot of jewels around the outside. Let's get deep. So the crucifix was created using a repoussé technique, or hammering up from the back. Jesus, calm and wide-eyed, seems to foreshadow his triumph over death. So I've also done sort of a deep dive on crucifixion images, and I can say this one is different from a lot, where Jesus is not shown in pain. He's not shown suffering. His eyes are wide open, so he's not dead. And his hands have been pierced, and there's blood falling down. I think I have another detail that I can show you that in a second. So each of these quadrants is filled with this little raised group of stones in settings on little tiny legs. And above and below them, there are these amazing figures, just incredible craftsmanship of figures, mostly angels, so they have wings on them, that are writhing. They seem to be very sad, as though all 8 of these figures are mourning the death of Jesus on the cross and lamenting. Crucifixion with angels and mourning figures. See? Up above Jesus's head, I mean, it's kind of unusual because this arm of the cross is just so tall, but up above his head is a depiction or a personification of the moon, and you can see a crescent on the head of that little figure. So little human type figure all curled up in a little ball, also weeping, and this is the sun. And then there's a tablet there. Let's see if my other detail. So yeah, here's the corpus, or the body of Jesus. The wounds on his hands give forth blood that is coagulating in little bunches that look like a bunch of grapes. And that is signifying that the blood will become the wine of the Eucharist, or the communion. So it's a symbolic representation of what his blood means. And the tablet above his head said sorry, the tablet above his head said, "Hic est Rex Iudeorum," which is Latin for "Here is the King of the Jews." So just stunning in its beauty. I think this piece is so amazing. So there you go. I like to say there you go when we're winding something up. Now we're going to go see what was happening in Spain. So never forget that Muslims were in Spain for a very long time, up until 1492. Here's Granada, here's Cordoba. So this is Al-Andalus down here, that was Muslim Spain. The frontier of Muslim Spain did change as people were fighting and trying to drive them out of Spain, but they didn't actually leave until 1492. So Visigoths ruled Spain until Muslim armies arrived in the 8th century. As we've already seen in Module 8, Spain was largely Muslim controlled throughout the Middle Ages. With some exception, Muslims allowed Christians and Jews to continue their practices, which resulted in great cultural exchange in Spain. Christian artists infused features of Islamic art in a style known as Mozarabic. And this will also be a quiz question. What country were people coexisting, people of different faiths? The rest of Europe is slowly becoming Christian, and there's a lot of struggle with that. But down in Spain, there's 3 religions practiced together, coexisting. Now, here's an interesting story. We're getting very close to the millennium, the first millennium. So theologians in northern Spain wrote biblical commentaries to refute heretical beliefs. A monk named Beatus wrote a commentary on the Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse, in which he interprets the visions of John in terms of the Muslim occupation of Spain. Several survive, several of these books that he wrote and were copied, he didn't write them all, survive and are referred to as the Beatus manuscripts. A Beatus manuscript produced by an artist named Maius includes a 7-headed dragon and a woman clothed with the sun, a scene from the biblical apocalypse. So it is a complex, abstract allegory of the triumph of the church over its enemies. So here it is. And this, look at the date, 940 to 945. A lot of people believe that this increased interest in Spain in interpreting the Book of Revelation in terms of the Muslims as the enemy of the church occurs because people believed in the year 1000 Jesus would return, and then everything predicted in the Book of Revelation would occur, and there would be an Antichrist, and I don't know, there's just all kinds of strange stuff. Some of you I know have read the book, and many of you have probably heard sermons preached on the book where people are interpreting that for our own times, and I can tell you, in case you didn't know, it has been interpreted in contemporary terms throughout history since it was first written down. People have been looking at this and saying, oh, yeah, that totally means this guy and this country and the here and now. So let's look at this manuscript, which, like I said, it became a thing in Spain. The style of drawing is very naive. That means very childlike. The Spanish manuscripts all share that style in common. Most of them have these wide bands of color in the background. So there's no attempt to make this look naturalistic. There's no illusionism here. It's just simply to illustrate this incredible story that the author and the artist interpreted as the very literal Word of God warning about the end times. And so up here in this corner we have God represented as a man sitting on a throne. And I want to apologize to people who follow a religion that find this blasphemous, but I'm very sorry. Europeans did not have any issue with depicting God the Father as a man. So you're going to see several. I think this is just the first. So there's God the Father sitting up on a chair in heaven. The woman clothed in the sun standing on the moon over here. She's been interpreted many ways. She often resembles Virgin Mary. We have a 7-headed serpent here, so this long snake with a knot in its body and 7 really monstrous heads coming out from that. Another band of stars up here, angels in heaven. Down here we have demons like fighting for the souls of humans and angels fighting for the souls. Oh, it's so exciting. So this is the one illustration. I think there's a quiz question where you need to know this is Spanish. So also think that that very naturalistic looking Matthew, the gospel writer who looked very Roman, was done considerably before this, and a totally different skill level of drawing here. Here's another illustration from that same Beatus, and this one I like to show you because some students have some romantic familiarity with the idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So here they are, the 4 horsemen, and now you can pause and look at them closely and identify which one is which. I'm not going to go into that. I'll show you another 4 horsemen later in the course. And here's a devil driving it on. So bad. Now, that's it for Spain. So you didn't get to see much. Sorry. I mean, there's quite a bit going on in Spain, and I'm sure you could see more if you took Art History 1. But this course, we're just flying through Europe. So going back up to the central continent of Europe, the Carolingian Empire ended in the late 9th century, and the vast territory of Charlemagne was divided into 3 areas. In the early 10th century, a ruler named Otto took over the eastern section and began the Ottonian Empire. The Ottonians intentionally sought to revive the great culture of the Carolingians, and more stone structures were built. So there's more architecture that survives from the Ottonian period. Ottonian artists began a tradition of large sculpture in wood and bronze. The Garo crucifix shows a tortured, life-size Christ whose body sags in death. It was meant to inspire pity and awe. We've never seen anything like this. I just showed you an early crucifixion that showed a wide awake, beardless Jesus who was not in pain, and he was definitely not dead. This is quite the opposite, where he looks very dead. His body seems to have real weight that pulls on his skin and causes his body to sag. This is also life-size. It would have been seen by everybody who came into the church in Köln, Germany. The book cover had a very small, limited audience, would have just been probably the priest or the monks at the monastery, whoever, a small audience. This was public art here. This would have been viewed by everyone. I also want to point out that it was created to be as shocking and realistic as it possibly could. I'm sure that on the first day that it was visible, that they'd place it in the church, that people coming into the church probably reacted with horror, thinking that they were actually looking at the real body of Jesus. And people may have fainted or screamed. I like to use my imagination and really see a strong reaction to this Garo crucifix. Another Ottonian piece is this set of doors that was created or commissioned by Bishop Bernward in Hildesheim. And it has scenes, biblical scenes here in bronze where, I'll just read this. Bronze doors made under the direction of Bishop Bernward in Germany represent a complex bronze casting project. The doors portrayed scenes from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament on the left and right side, respectively. Scenes are complementary pairs meant to enhance each other's meanings. So over here you have the creation and fall of mankind ending with, I believe, the murder of Abel down at the bottom. And then over here, it begins with the Annunciation to Mary, the story of Jesus on this side, ending with the, the resurrection, where Jesus rises up out of the grave. And this is an Ottonian church. Nothing much to point out here except that it is a very nice stone basilica, and in a lot of ways it looks very much like our Roman basilicas from long, long ago. So by basilica you have this large open nave with clear story windows. This one has a gallery on the side and a nice nave arcade and apse there. So it's evolved from the Roman basilica, but it's still very recognizable as a basilica. This is the sort of building that would have been made during Charlemagne's reign, but made of wood, and that's why they don't exist. So flat timber roof, there's all your attributes. It's great. And it's been nicely restored, kept up. So the Ottonian Empire, illuminated manuscripts were often funded by secular rulers. This is a presentation of a gospel book for Abbess Hitta, and it represents the abbess offering the book to Walpurga atop a rocky, undulating strip of landscape in the background. It's and this one also, Ottonian manuscript. By secular. The Gospels of Otto III showed influence of Byzantine art. The architecture was more controlled and balanced. Figures are tall and slender in a scene portraying Jesus' hospitality. This is Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And gold is used in the background for Jesus. This is significantly a Byzantine influence. Also, nice background bands of color there. It's not going to show up on the quiz. So this is the end of Chapter 10, Part 2. The last part will be Romanesque art. And be sure to watch that because Romanesque is very different from what we've seen.